As I stepped into Willow Grove, I felt the familiar weight of invisible eyes pressing against my back. The restaurant was immaculate, polished floors, golden chandeliers, and an air of exclusivity that whispered wealth and privilege. But none of that mattered when they saw me. I hadn't even crossed the threshold when their gazes froze me in place. I wasn't Elijah Gaines, a successful entrepreneur. To them, I was just another black man walking into a space they believed wasn't mine.
"Excuse me,"
came a saccharine voice laced with contempt. I turned to see her, Evelyn Whitaker, blonde, poised, and beautiful, in a way that would have been disarming if not for the sharp, icy glint in her eyes. Her smile was perfectly practiced, a facade thin enough to see the disdain bleeding through.
"I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight."
Her words hit harder than they should have, not because I believed them, but because they were wrapped in that infuriating veil of politeness. I glanced around, tables empty, chairs unoccupied, yet here I was being turned away.
"You're mistaken,"
I replied, my voice steady.
"I'm here to dine."
Evelyn's mask slipped just for a second, revealing the truth beneath. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice as if offering a secret.
"This isn't the kind of place for someone like you."
Someone like me? The phrase lingered in the air like a foul stench. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but instead, I let silence hang between us. It wasn't worth arguing, not yet. Her words would echo differently soon enough. So I smiled, calm, unbothered, and stepped aside.
"You'll regret this."
I said, my tone devoid of malice but heavy with certainty.
"And when you do, I'll be back, not as a customer, but as your boss."
The words landed like a thunderclap. Evelyn blinked, but before she could respond, I turned and walked away, feeling the weight of every gaze following me out. They didn't know it yet, but their world had already begun to crumble. What would you do if you walked into a room and everyone judged you before you even spoke? Have you ever felt the sting of prejudice? A silent, cutting verdict passed based solely on your appearance? Today, we're diving into a story that's not just about justice, but transformation. It's about how one moment of arrogance and bias can unravel a carefully constructed world. But most importantly, it's about the power of resilience, humility, and second chances. If this story moves you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Together, we can keep spreading powerful stories that inspire change and remind us all of the humanity that binds us. Now, let's step back into Willow Grove and see how this unexpected turn of events unfolds. The golden glow of the evening sun spilled through the tall, arched windows of Willow Grove, casting soft rays over the polished oak tables and white linen cloths. The hum of low conversations blended with the gentle clinking of silverware, creating an ambiance that felt equal parts luxurious and unapproachable. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a fortress of exclusivity where every detail, down to the flickering candlelight, was designed to whisper one thing: you don't belong here unless we say you do. Elijah Gaines stepped through the grand double doors, his figure cutting a sharp silhouette against the opulent interior. Dressed in a finely tailored navy suit that fit him like a second skin, he exuded quiet authority. His polished leather shoes clicked softly against the marble floor as he walked, and the slight adjustment of his silver cufflinks was the only hint of the confidence he carried within. Yet, as soon as he entered, a shift rippled through the room. The hushed voices faltered, forks paused mid-air. It wasn't blatant, but it was undeniable, the unspoken judgment of every pair of eyes that turned to him. They didn't see his success, his wealth, or the quiet dignity in the way he held himself. All they saw was his skin. Elijah's gaze swept the room briefly. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered this subtle form of hostility masquerading as indifference. He had lived through it his entire life, those fleeting glances that lasted just long enough to cut deep, the tightened grips on purses, the polite but firm barriers erected by invisible walls of bias. He walked further inside, unbothered on the surface but keenly aware of the silent undercurrent of resistance flowing toward him. Every step he took felt deliberate, calculated, a statement in itself. He was a man who belonged wherever he chose to be, but tonight, that wasn't how the staff of Willow Grove saw it. Behind the mahogany counter, Evelyn Whitaker, the restaurant's manager, stood with an air of effortless grace. Her ivory silk blouse contrasted perfectly with her neatly pinned blonde hair. and her posture spoke of a woman accustomed to authority. She glanced up from her clipboard, her blue eyes locking on Elijah. For a brief moment, her expression was unreadable, but then her lips curled into a small, tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a smile Elijah had seen before, a calculated expression designed to maintain professionalism while masking a deeper contempt. Evelyn leaned slightly over the counter, her movements controlled and deliberate, as if to assert her presence in the space she clearly believed she owned. The restaurant staff mirrored her attitude, each interaction a subtle reminder that Elijah was out of place in their eyes. A waiter passed by him, holding a tray laden with champagne flutes, his pace quickening just slightly as he avoided making eye contact. A hostess by the entrance fiddled nervously with her seating chart, pretending not to notice Elijah standing a mere few feet away. Elijah stopped at the center of the dining room, his calm demeanor unshaken by the palpable tension. His presence disrupted the carefully curated ecosystem of privilege within the restaurant, and everyone felt it. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were so comfortable in their prejudices, so secure in their assumptions, that they didn't even consider the possibility of who he might truly be. He lingered for a moment, his gaze meeting Evelyn's across the room. Her polished exterior faltered ever so slightly under the weight of his steady, unflinching stare. But she recovered quickly, her expression settling into a facade of polite detachment. This was just the beginning, Elijah thought. They had no idea that their assumptions and biases would soon cost them dearly. And as he took another step forward, the subtle power dynamic in the room began to shift. Not because they realized their error, but because Elijah had already decided it was time to teach them what real power looked like. The quiet hum of conversation began to shift as Elijah continued to walk further into the restaurant. It wasn't loud enough to be a disruption. These were, after all, patrons who prided themselves on decorum, but the change was unmistakable. The air thickened, words grew hushed, and eyes darted toward him, lingering just a beat too long. It was a symphony of subtle exclusion, a performance these people likely didn't even realize they had perfected. At the bar, a man in a crisp navy blazer leaned toward his companion, his voice barely audible, but his glance unmistakable. They exchanged a knowing look, the kind of silent communication that spoke volumes. What is he doing here? Across the room, a woman adjusted her pearl necklace, her movements quick and uneasy as her gaze flitted toward Elijah, like he was an intruder who had mistakenly wandered into her private garden. Elijah noticed it all, every flicker of discomfort, every unspoken judgment, but he moved as if the room belonged to him. His stride was calm, deliberate. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here to observe, to see just how far they would take their biases. Behind the counter, Evelyn Whitaker's practiced smile hardened. She set down the pen she had been holding, her perfectly manicured nails tapping once against the clipboard. There was something unnerving about the way he carried himself. Most people, when met with the kind of collective rejection Elijah faced, would shrink under its weight. They would turn away, offer an apology, or at least show a flicker of uncertainty. But he didn't. Evelyn didn't like that. She straightened her posture, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she approached. Her presence was magnetic, blonde hair tied into an elegant twist, her tailored blouse accentuating a figure that commanded attention. But beneath her polished exterior was a rigidity that spoke of control, of someone who believed she knew exactly how the world should work. She stopped a few feet from Elijah, her gaze moving from his face to his suit, and then to the polished shoes that seemed out of place to her. It was the kind of appraisal meant to deconstruct a person in seconds, to decide if they were worthy of her attention. And in her mind, he wasn't. "Good evening," she said, her voice smooth but cool, like the surface of a frozen pond. "How can I help you?" Elijah met her gaze, unflinching. There was no need to explain himself, no need to justify his presence. "I'd like a table for one." Evelyn's lips twitched, the corners threatening to curl into something resembling amusement. She glanced toward the dining area, where at least 3 tables sat empty, their white linens untouched and perfectly arranged. But instead of leading him toward them, she folded her arms across her chest. "I'm so sorry," she said, with a tone so insincere it practically dripped from her words. "But we're fully booked tonight." Her response was calculated. She didn't raise her voice, didn't say anything overtly offensive. That wasn't her style. No, Evelyn operated in the space between politeness and prejudice. where her words could be excused as mere coincidence, her actions as harmless oversight. Elijah's jaw tightened for just a moment before relaxing again. He let her words hang in the air, giving her just enough time to realize he wasn't going to buy into her charade. "Fully booked?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Yes," she replied, her smile growing tighter. "I'm afraid we don't have any available seating at the moment. Perhaps you'd like to try somewhere else?" Somewhere else. The phrase echoed in Elijah's mind, not because it surprised him, but because it confirmed everything he already knew about this place. It wasn't just the staff, it was the culture, the unspoken rules that dictated who belonged and who didn't. Before he could respond, a waiter, Nathaniel Cross, passed by with a tray of drinks. His steps faltered when he saw Elijah standing there, but he quickly recovered, pretending not to notice him at all. Nathaniel had been watching the interaction from afar, and though his face remained neutral, his avoidance spoke louder than any words could. Evelyn's gaze flicked toward Nathaniel briefly, as if silently instructing him to stay out of it. This was her domain, and she wasn't about to let anyone undermine her authority. She turned back to Elijah, her expression softening just enough to appear friendly. "If you'd like," she offered, as though she were doing him a favor, "I can call ahead to another restaurant for you. I'm sure they'd be happy to accommodate." Elijah let out a soft breath, his calm exterior never wavering. He wasn't here to argue or plead for their acceptance. He had no interest in playing the game they had so carefully constructed. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. "I'll take care of it," he said simply, leaving the words open to interpretation. Evelyn hesitated for a split second, her confidence flickering like a candle in the wind. But then she regained her composure, offering another tight-lipped smile. "Of course. Have a wonderful evening." As Elijah turned and walked toward the door, the weight of every gaze in the room followed him. For a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if he would explode, if he would demand an explanation or call them out for what they all knew was happening. But Elijah did none of those things. Instead, he paused at the door, his hand resting lightly on the handle. Without looking back, he spoke, his words quiet but deliberate. "I'll see you again," he said. The room remained silent as the door closed behind him, his presence lingering long after he had gone. Elijah stood still for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. Behind him, the air in Willow Grove hung heavy with unspoken tension. The quiet was deafening, broken only by the soft clinking of glassware and the faint murmur of whispers that rippled across the room. He could feel their stares boring into his back, the weight of their silent judgments pressing against him. But Elijah was no stranger to this. He had lived through years of being seen as less than, of walking into rooms where his accomplishments, his intelligence, his very humanity were overshadowed by the color of his skin. Tonight, however, wasn't about rage or retaliation. It was about patience. Evelyn, still standing behind the counter, watched him with a look that teetered between triumph and unease. Her fingers gripped the edge of the polished wood, as if bracing herself for a reaction she was sure would come. She had seen it before: anger, indignation, raised voices demanding explanations. But Elijah gave her nothing. With measured calm, he turned back toward the room, letting his gaze sweep over every corner of the restaurant. The polished tables, the dimly lit chandeliers, the carefully curated clientele who sat frozen in their seats. It all felt like a stage, and tonight, they were the unwitting actors in a play they didn't even know had begun. Elijah's eyes locked with Evelyn's, holding her gaze with a quiet intensity that made her shift slightly in place. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice steady and deliberate, each word landing with the weight of unspoken consequences. "Maybe not tonight, but soon enough." Her lips parted slightly, the faintest flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "Have a good evening, sir," she said, her tone dripping with forced civility. Elijah offered no response. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks, a small, deliberate gesture that carried more meaning than words ever could. It was a reminder, a subtle, unspoken statement that he was not a man to be underestimated. He turned and began to walk toward the door, his steps measured, unhurried. Each click of his leather soles against the marble floor resonated in the silent room, a sound that seemed to echo louder with every step. As he passed a group of diners seated near the entrance, One of the men, a middle-aged businessman with a sharp suit and a sharper tongue, leaned slightly toward his companion. "Guess he didn't get the memo," the man muttered under his breath, his tone laced with condescension. Elijah paused mid-step, his ears catching the words, despite their hushed delivery. Slowly, he turned his head, his gaze locking onto the man with a calm yet piercing intensity. The businessman froze, his smirk faltering under the weight of Elijah's stare. It was a moment that stretched longer than it should have, charged with an unspoken challenge that left the man shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Satisfied, Elijah resumed his exit, pushing the door open with a deliberate ease. The cool evening air greeted him, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. He paused just outside, taking a deep breath as he let the tension dissipate from his shoulders. The night was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows across the cobblestone walkway. For a brief moment, Elijah stood there, his hands resting in his pockets, as he looked back at the glowing windows of Willow Grove. Behind the glass, he could still see the silhouettes of diners and staff moving about, oblivious to the storm that was quietly brewing. A faint smile touched his lips, not one of amusement, but of certainty. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Pulling out his phone, Elijah typed a quick message, his fingers moving with purpose. Within moments, he hit send, the screen displaying a simple confirmation: transaction complete. The restaurant's future had already changed. They just didn't know it yet. Tomorrow, the people inside would wake to a new reality, one where the very man they had dismissed and disrespected would hold their fates in his hands. Elijah took one last look at Willow Grove, his expression calm yet resolute. "Let them enjoy tonight," he murmured to himself, his voice low and steady. "Because tomorrow, everything changes." And with that, he turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the cool Savannah night. Behind him, the world of Willow Grove remained blissfully unaware of the reckoning that was already on its way. The morning sunlight filtered through the glass facade of Willow Grove, painting the restaurant's interior in a warm, golden glow. Everything appeared just as it had the night before: polished tables, perfectly arranged place settings, and a quiet hum of preparation as the staff prepared for another busy day. Yet, beneath the familiar surface, an undercurrent of change had already begun to ripple. At precisely 10 a.m., the front doors swung open. Elijah Gaines stepped inside, his presence as commanding as ever. This time, however, there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. He wasn't here as a customer seeking a meal. He was here as a man who held the power to rewrite the rules of the very space he had once been excluded from. Evelyn Whitaker was the first to notice him. She stood near the bar, clipboard in hand, her usual air of authority on full display. Her expression tightened the moment her eyes met Elijah's, a flicker of recognition flashing across her face. For a brief second, confusion clouded her features. Why was he back? And why did he carry himself as though the entire restaurant belonged to him? "Elijah," she said, her voice laced with forced politeness as she approached. Her smile was thin, her tone a touch too sweet. "I wasn't expecting you again." Elijah met her gaze with calm intensity. "Good morning," he said simply, his voice steady, his presence unshakable. Evelyn's eyes darted to the door, as if searching for an explanation, or perhaps an escape. "I'm afraid we don't open for another hour," she continued, her tone faltering slightly. "If you'd like to make a reservation—" "That won't be necessary," Elijah interrupted, his words carrying the weight of authority. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and withdrew a sleek leather folder. Holding it in one hand, he placed it deliberately on the nearest table. Evelyn's confusion deepened. Her brows knitted together as she glanced at the folder, then back at Elijah. "What is this?" she asked, her voice quieter now, uncertainty creeping in. Elijah stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "It's the paperwork for the ownership transfer," he said, each word precise and deliberate. "As of this morning, Willow Grove belongs to me." The room seemed to freeze. For a moment, even the faint clinking of glasses in the background ceased, as if the world itself had paused to process the revelation. Evelyn stared at him, her polished exterior beginning to crack under the weight of his statement. That can't be right," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her fingers reached for the folder, flipping it open with trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the documents, her gaze darting across the legal jargon that confirmed her worst fears. "It's all there," Elijah continued, his tone calm but unyielding. "The sale was finalized yesterday evening. I'm here to meet with the staff and discuss the changes that will be implemented moving forward." Evelyn's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came out. Her confidence, the carefully constructed shield she wore like armor, was crumbling right before him. She looked up at Elijah, her expression a mixture of disbelief, panic, and something else: fear. Across the room, Nathaniel Cross and Hannah Pryor, two of the restaurant's senior employees, exchanged wide-eyed glances. Whispers began to ripple among the staff, growing louder with each passing second. "Elijah," Evelyn finally managed, her voice trembling despite her attempt to remain composed. This must be some kind of misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Elijah said firmly. He gestured toward the dining area, his movements measured and deliberate. "I'll be addressing the entire team shortly. Please gather everyone here within the next 5 minutes." Evelyn hesitated, her hands clutching the folder as though it might somehow change what she had just read. But Elijah's gaze left no room for negotiation. Defeated, she nodded stiffly and turned to relay his instructions to the staff. As the employees began to gather, Elijah took a moment to survey the room. The same tables that had been occupied by judgmental diners the night before now stood empty, waiting to be redefined. The atmosphere was different this morning, no longer suffused with quiet hostility, but charged with anticipation and uncertainty. When the last of the staff had assembled, Elijah stepped forward, his presence commanding their full attention. He allowed a moment of silence to stretch, ensuring every eye was on him before he spoke. "For those of you who don't know me," he began, his voice steady and firm, "my name is Elijah Gaines. As of today, I am the new owner of Willow Grove." The room erupted into hushed murmurs, some employees glancing at one another with disbelief, others shifting uncomfortably where they stood. Evelyn stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, her expression unreadable, but her tension palpable. Elijah continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I'm aware of the culture that has existed here," he said, his tone carrying an edge that silenced the murmurs. "I've experienced it firsthand. And let me be clear, things are going to change." He let the weight of his words settle over them before continuing. "This restaurant will no longer operate on exclusion or entitlement. From this day forward, respect and professionalism will be the foundation of everything we do. Anyone unwilling to adapt to this new standard is free to leave." The room fell silent once again, the gravity of his words pressing down on everyone present. Elijah's gaze lingered on Evelyn for a moment longer than the others, his expression unreadable, but his intent clear. "This isn't about punishment," he added, his tone softening slightly but losing none of its resolve. "It's about opportunity, an opportunity to rebuild something better for everyone." As the staff exchanged uncertain glances, Elijah stepped back, signaling the end of his announcement. The game had officially begun, and the rules had just changed. The room was so silent, you could hear the faint ticking of the antique clock mounted above the bar. Evelyn stood frozen, her grip tightening on the clipboard she hadn't even realized she was still holding. Around her, the staff exchanged nervous glances, their unease palpable. For years, Evelyn had commanded respect, or at least obedience, through her cold, calculated demeanor. But now, that veneer of control was slipping, cracking under the weight of Elijah's presence. Nathaniel Cross, standing near the kitchen doors, shifted uncomfortably, his brows furrowed as if trying to process what had just been said. Hannah Pryor, who had been stacking glasses moments earlier, stopped mid-motion, the glass in her hand trembling slightly. Neither dared to speak, but their expressions mirrored the same question. How did this happen? Evelyn finally found her voice, though it wavered in a way that betrayed her usual composure. This can't be right," she said, her words stumbling over themselves. She took a step forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "There must be some sort of mistake. Ownership transfers don't happen overnight. Who approved this?" Elijah, standing calm and collected at the center of the room, met her gaze with unwavering steadiness. His presence was a stark contrast to her unraveling confidence. "There's no mistake," he said, his tone even but firm. "Everything was finalized yesterday. The paperwork is in your hands, Evelyn. You've already seen it for yourself." Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She turned her attention back to the folder she still clutched, flipping through the pages as if hoping to find some loophole, some way to reverse the inevitable. But the bold black ink on every page confirmed what she refused to believe. Elijah Gaines was now her boss. Nathaniel, emboldened by Evelyn's hesitation, took a cautious step forward. "Is this for real?" he asked, his voice low but edged with disbelief. "I mean, you're the new owner?" Elijah shifted his gaze to Nathaniel, his expression softening slightly but losing none of its authority. "Yes," he replied simply. "I am." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his discomfort evident. He glanced at Evelyn as if waiting for her to take control of the situation. But she remained silent, her face a mask of barely contained frustration. "I think we need to discuss this privately," Evelyn said suddenly, her voice regaining a hint of its usual sharpness. She took a step closer to Elijah, lowering her voice in an attempt to regain the upper hand. "Whatever this is, I'm sure we can resolve it. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Elijah interrupted, his tone firm but calm. "This isn't up for negotiation, Evelyn. The transfer is complete, and the changes I've outlined will take effect immediately." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her composure slipping further. She was used to being the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now, the ground beneath her feet was shifting, and she didn't know how to steady herself. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything?" she said, her voice rising slightly. "This place has a reputation, a clientele. It's not some experiment for you to play with." Elijah raised an eyebrow, her words failing to provoke the reaction she had hoped for. "You're right," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Willow Grove does have a reputation, and I've experienced that reputation firsthand." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, their implication unmistakable. Evelyn's lips parted, but no rebuttal came. The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in as the power dynamic continued to shift. "I'm not here to argue," Elijah continued, stepping closer. His voice was low, but carried the kind of authority that commanded attention. "I'm here to ensure that this restaurant becomes a place where every person who walks through those doors is treated with dignity and respect. If you can't align yourself with that vision, then you're free to leave." Evelyn stiffened, her pride refusing to let her back down. "I've worked here for years," she said, her tone defensive. "I've built this place into what it is today. And I'm not here to take that away from you," Elijah replied, his gaze steady. "But what I won't allow is for anyone, staff, management, or otherwise, to perpetuate the kind of discrimination I experienced here last night. That ends now." His words landed like a hammer blow, shattering the last remnants of Evelyn's confidence. For a moment, she said nothing, her mind racing as she tried to regain control of the situation. But deep down, she knew there was no way to argue against the truth he had laid bare. Nathaniel shifted uneasily, his gaze flicking between Elijah and Evelyn. The tension in the room was almost suffocating, every person present holding their breath as they waited for what would happen next. Elijah turned his attention back to the assembled staff, his voice carrying a quiet authority that demanded their focus. "This isn't about punishing anyone," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "It's about creating an environment where everyone, staff and patrons alike, feels valued. If you're willing to be a part of that, then I'm willing to work with you. But if you're not, then I won't force you to stay." The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. Evelyn's fists clenched at her sides, her jaw tightening as she struggled to process what had just happened. For the first time in years, she was no longer the one in control. "I'll stay," she said finally, her voice quieter now, tinged with a mix of defiance and resignation. "But don't think for a second that I'll just stand by and let you dismantle everything I've built." Elijah met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Good," he said simply. "Because if you're staying, you'd better be ready to prove your worth." The tension in the room didn't dissipate as Elijah stepped back, signaling the end of their exchange. If anything, it grew heavier, a silent acknowledgement that the days ahead would be anything but easy. The air in the room was thick with tension, every eye locked on Elijah as he stood at the center of the dining area. The weight of his words from earlier still lingered, pressing down on the assembled staff like a storm cloud. Evelyn, arms crossed tightly over her chest, stood to the side, her expression a mix of restrained frustration and reluctant acceptance. Nathaniel and Hannah hovered near the kitchen door, their unease written across their faces. Elijah took a moment to let the silence settle, scanning the room with a measured gaze that commanded attention. "This restaurant is about to undergo some changes," he began, his voice steady but firm. "Changes that are long overdue." A murmur rippled through the staff, but no one dared to speak. Evelyn's jaw tightened, her fingers drumming impatiently against her arm. "Let me be clear," Elijah continued, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Willow Grove will no longer be a place where appearances dictate treatment. The days of judgment based on skin color, status, or anything other than respect and professionalism are over." The declaration landed like a hammer, shattering the thin veneer of composure some of the staff had tried to maintain. Nathaniel exchanged a quick glance with Hannah, his lips pressed into a tight line. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening as though bracing herself against an invisible blow. "This isn't just about what happened last night," Elijah said, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of each staff member in turn. "It's about creating an environment where every person who walks through those doors, whether they're a customer or an employee, feels valued. That starts today." Evelyn finally broke her silence, her voice sharp. "And what exactly does that mean?" she asked, her words cutting through the room like a blade. Elijah turned to her, his calm demeanor unwavering. "It means that we're implementing a new set of standards that prioritize respect, equality, and accountability. Every member of this team will be held to those standards, no exceptions." Her eyes flickered with defiance, but she said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. Elijah continued, his voice steady but commanding. "There will also be changes to the management structure. Effective immediately, there will be a new general manager in place." The room fell deathly silent. Evelyn's eyes widened, the words hitting her like a physical blow. "You're replacing me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and indignation. Elijah's gaze remained fixed on her. "You'll retain a position here, Evelyn," he said, his tone measured but firm. "But it won't be in management. You'll have an opportunity to prove that you can adapt to this new system if you choose to stay." The tension in the room was palpable, every staff member holding their breath as they waited for Evelyn's reaction, her face flushed, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "This is absurd," she snapped. "I've dedicated years to this place. I've built it into what it is today." "And that's exactly why I'm giving you the chance to stay," Elijah replied calmly. "Because I believe you're capable of contributing to something better. But the choice is yours." Evelyn glared at him, her pride warring with the cold reality of her situation. She wanted to argue, to fight back, but deep down, she knew the power had shifted. Elijah turned his attention back to the rest of the staff, his voice steady. "For those of you who choose to stay, understand this. The old ways of doing things are gone. From now on, this will be a place of opportunity, not privilege. Respect will be earned, not assumed. And those who can't align with that vision are free to leave." Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting toward Evelyn as though seeking her guidance. Hannah avoided eye contact altogether, her hands fidgeting nervously. Elijah let the silence stretch, giving his words time to sink in. "I'm not here to make this easy," he said finally. "Change never is. But I am here to make this better. For everyone." The room remained silent, the weight of his declaration hanging heavy in the air. For a moment, no one moved, the tension so thick it felt almost suffocating. Then, slowly, one of the younger staff members, a server named Mia, stepped forward. "I'll stay," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension. I think this is the right thing to do." Elijah nodded, offering her a small, encouraging smile. "Thank you, Mia," he said. Her quiet declaration seemed to break the spell. A few other staff members began to murmur their agreement, their words hesitant but sincere. Nathaniel and Hannah exchanged a glance, their expressions uncertain, but neither spoke up. Evelyn remained silent, her face a mask of restrained fury. "This is just the beginning," Elijah said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "We have a lot of work to do, but I believe in the potential of this team and this restaurant. Let's prove what we're capable of." With that, he stepped back, signaling the end of the meeting. The staff began to disperse slowly, the weight of his words still heavy on their shoulders. Evelyn lingered, her gaze fixed on Elijah with a mixture of defiance and something else, something that looked almost like doubt. As the room emptied, Elijah stood alone for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the space. This was more than a restaurant now. It was a stage for change, a place where assumptions would be challenged and new possibilities would take root. And this was only the beginning. The transformation of Willow Grove began the moment Elijah stepped into his office, a quiet yet commanding presence. The office, which once housed Evelyn's carefully curated trophies and meticulously arranged files, now bore a more minimalist touch. Elijah wasn't interested in decor or accolades. He was here to rebuild from the ground up. His first order of business was assembling a management team that shared his vision of equality, professionalism, and respect. The first person he called was Jeremiah Fulton, a seasoned manager with years of experience in the hospitality industry. Jeremiah, a tall, composed man in his late 30s with a calm yet authoritative demeanor, was no stranger to the challenges of leadership. Like Elijah, he had faced his share of prejudice, and he had learned how to navigate it with grace and determination. When Jeremiah arrived for his first meeting with Elijah, his handshake was firm, his posture confident. "It's good to see a place finally getting things right," he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. Elijah nodded, his own smile brief but genuine. "I'm counting on you to help me make this more than just a restaurant," he replied. "This is a statement." Jeremiah's smile widened slightly. "Then let's get to work." Next came Naomi Rivers, a young but driven woman with a spark of ambition that Elijah recognized immediately. Naomi, a former server who had worked her way up in a smaller restaurant, had been passed over for promotions too many times, always for reasons that had nothing to do with her performance. When Elijah called her with the offer, her initial reaction was disbelief. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice cautious but tinged with hope. "Very," Elijah replied. "I need people who understand hard work and value respect. From what I've seen, that's exactly who you are." Naomi's voice softened, the disbelief giving way to gratitude. "I won't let you down," she promised. When Jeremiah and Naomi walked into Willow Grove for the first time as the new management team, the shift in energy was palpable. Jeremiah, with his measured stride and composed authority, and Naomi, with her bright determination, were a stark contrast to the tension still simmering among the existing staff. Evelyn watched their arrival from the far corner of the restaurant, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had spent the last few days alternating between quiet defiance and simmering resentment. Seeing Jeremiah step confidently into the space that once felt entirely hers was almost too much to bear. Nathaniel's reaction was less guarded. "So that's the new boss, huh?" he muttered to Hannah, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like we're in for a real treat." Hannah, ever the pragmatist, shot him a warning glance. "Careful," she whispered. "You don't want to get on their bad side." Jeremiah wasted no time establishing his presence. As the staff gathered for the first team meeting under his leadership, he stood at the front of the room beside Elijah, his hands clasped in front of him. Naomi stood just behind them, her clipboard in hand, ready to take notes. "Good morning, everyone," Jeremiah began, his voice calm but commanding. "I'm Jeremiah Fulton, your new general manager. I'm here to help build something we can all be proud of, but that's going to take work, real work." The room was silent, the staff shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Evelyn sat near the back, her expression unreadable but her tension evident. Jeremiah continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "I know change isn't easy, and I know some of you might not agree with what's happening here. But this isn't about any one person. This is about creating a space where everyone feels welcome, staff and customers alike." Nathaniel let out a quiet scoff, barely audible but enough to draw Jeremiah's attention. Without missing a beat, Jeremiah locked eyes with him, his expression firm but calm. "Is there something you'd like to share?" he asked. Nathaniel shifted in his seat, his confidence faltering under Jeremiah's steady gaze. "No," he muttered, looking away. "Good," Jeremiah replied, his tone even. "Because we're here to move forward, not backward." As the days went on, the resistance from the existing staff became more apparent. Nathaniel, emboldened by his years under Evelyn's leadership, made little effort to hide his disdain for the changes. He would roll his eyes during team meetings, make snide comments under his breath, and take every opportunity to undermine Jeremiah's authority. Evelyn, though more subtle, was no less resistant. She maintained a veneer of professionalism, but her every interaction with Jeremiah and Naomi was laced with quiet defiance. When Jeremiah implemented a new scheduling system to ensure fairness, Evelyn questioned every detail, framing her challenges as concerns, while making it clear she didn't trust his decisions. Naomi, for her part, refused to be intimidated. She worked tirelessly, earning the respect of the newer staff members who appreciated her dedication and fairness. But even she couldn't ignore the tension simmering just beneath the surface. One afternoon, as Naomi was reviewing the schedule, she overheard Nathaniel muttering to another server. "I give it a month before this place falls apart," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Naomi didn't hesitate. She approached him, her voice calm but firm. "If you have concerns, Nathaniel, you should bring them to me or Jeremiah directly," she said, her gaze steady. Nathaniel turned to her, his smirk faltering under her steady gaze. "I was just talking," he said, his tone defensive. "Good," Naomi replied, her voice unwavering. "Because talking doesn't fix problems. Actions do." Despite the resistance, Elijah remained confident. He watched from his office as Jeremiah and Naomi navigated the challenges with grace and determination. He knew the process wouldn't be easy. Real change never was. But as he observed the subtle shifts in the team's dynamics, he felt a quiet sense of hope. Willow Grove was changing, slowly, painfully, but undeniably, and Elijah was ready for whatever came next. Willow Grove was no stranger to tension, but now it was palpable, coursing through every interaction like an undercurrent threatening to pull everyone under. The source of this unrest was not a mystery. Evelyn Whitaker and Nathaniel Cross, the remnants of the old regime, had decided they weren't going down without a fight. Evelyn, though outwardly professional, was a master at wielding subtle sabotage. She didn't yell, didn't make overtly insubordinate moves. Instead, her rebellion was quiet but calculated. A missed signature here, a delayed response there. Each act was small enough to appear inconsequential, but disruptive enough to create chaos. One Monday morning, Evelyn sat at her former desk, now repurposed for Naomi. She pretended to sort through the reservation log, but purposefully rearranged the entries, leaving out key details about large party bookings. By mid-afternoon, the restaurant was overrun with confused guests, many of whom were double-booked for the same tables. "What's going on here?" Naomi asked, stepping in to address the commotion. Her voice remained calm, but her eyes scanned the chaos with precision. Evelyn approached, clipboard in hand, her expression serene, but laced with feigned concern. "I'm not sure," she said lightly. "The system must have glitched. It's such a shame, isn't it? Technology can be so unreliable." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly, catching the flicker of smugness Evelyn failed to fully conceal. "I'll fix it," Naomi replied firmly, her voice steady. "And we'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Evelyn nodded, her smile tight. "Of course. Let me know if you need any guidance." The remark hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Naomi didn't take the bait. Instead, she turned her focus back to resolving the issue, earning approving nods from a few of the newer staff members who had been watching. Nathaniel, on the other hand, was far less subtle. His defiance played out in loud, obnoxious displays that left little doubt about his disdain for the new system. One evening, as the dinner rush began, Nathaniel intentionally sent orders to the wrong tables, claiming, "The new ticketing system is confusing." Jeremiah caught the mistake quickly and pulled Nathaniel aside. "We need to talk," he said, his tone calm but firm. Nathaniel shrugged, his posture loose and careless. "It's not my fault if this new system is impossible to figure out," he said, his voice dripping with mock innocence. Jeremiah's gaze remained steady. "The system is clear, Nathaniel. You've had more than enough time to learn it." Nathaniel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Maybe the problem isn't the system," he said with a smirk. "Maybe it's the people running it." Jeremiah's expression didn't waver, but there was steel in his voice when he replied, "If you can't adapt, Nathaniel, I suggest you reconsider whether this is the right place for you." Nathaniel chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere. Someone needs to stick around to remind you of how things used to work." Jeremiah held his gaze for a moment longer before stepping back. "Then I suggest you get back to work," he said simply. It wasn't long before tensions came to a head. One afternoon, as the staff gathered for a routine meeting, Evelyn took the opportunity to question Jeremiah's leadership in front of the team. "Jeremiah," she began, her tone polite but cutting, "I've noticed some inconsistencies in the new scheduling system. It seems like certain employees are being given preferential treatment when it comes to shifts." Jeremiah raised an eyebrow, unbothered by her veiled accusation. "If there are concerns, I'm happy to address them," he said calmly. "The schedules are based on availability and performance metrics, as we discussed." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Of course," she said, "but I can't help but wonder if some of the newer staff members are being prioritized over those of us who've been here longer." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Evelyn's words were deliberate, meant to sow division among the staff. Nathaniel smirked from his seat, clearly enjoying the show. Naomi, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, finally spoke up. "If you have specific concerns, Evelyn," she said, her voice clear and steady, "we can review them together after this meeting, but right now, we're here to focus on moving forward as a team." Evelyn's eyes flicked toward Naomi, a flash of irritation crossing her face. But before she could respond, Elijah entered the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. Evelyn hesitated, her usual confidence faltering slightly. "No problem," she said quickly, her tone subdued. Elijah nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before addressing the group. "Good," he said, "because we don't have time for distractions. There's work to be done, and I expect everyone here to be focused on making this place the best it can be." Despite their best efforts, Evelyn and Nathaniel's resistance began to backfire. The newer staff members, inspired by Jeremiah and Naomi's leadership, started to rally around the new system. They appreciated the fairness and transparency Elijah had introduced, and their enthusiasm began to outshine the negativity emanating from Evelyn and Nathaniel. One evening, as Naomi was closing out the register, a younger server approached her hesitantly. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said quietly, "for giving people like me a chance." Naomi smiled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "We're all in this together," she replied. Evelyn watched the interaction from a distance, her expression unreadable. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind. Perhaps the old ways weren't as unshakable as she had believed. The first signs of change at Willow Grove were subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The meticulous rearrangement of schedules ensured fairness for all staff members, while newly implemented team meetings gave everyone a voice, something that had been missing for far too long. Yet, the biggest change wasn't in the policies or procedures, it was in the atmosphere. Where once the restaurant had been a fortress of exclusivity, there was now a sense of cautious optimism. It was fragile, like a delicate thread stretched taut, but it was there, and it was growing stronger every day. Jeremiah's steady leadership began to take root among the team. His presence was a calming force, a sharp contrast to the undercurrent of hostility that still lingered from Evelyn and Nathaniel. He held weekly one-on-one check-ins with the staff, taking time to listen and address their concerns. For the first time, employees felt seen and heard. Naomi, with her tireless energy and unwavering commitment, became the go-to person for problem-solving. Her approachable demeanor and natural empathy made her a favorite among the newer hires, who often came to her for advice or just a kind word. One day, during a particularly busy lunch shift, a young server named Mia hesitated near the kitchen door, nervously clutching a tray of steaming dishes. Naomi noticed her from across the room and immediately stepped in. "Everything okay, Mia?" she asked gently. Mia nodded hesitantly. I'm not sure which table this goes to. The numbers aren't clear." Naomi smiled reassuringly. "Let's figure it out together," she said, taking the tray from Mia and walking her through the seating chart. "It's okay to ask for help. That's what we're here for." Mia's shoulders relaxed and a small smile crept across her face. "Thanks, Naomi," she said. Evelyn watched the interaction from a distance, her expression unreadable. It was a small moment, but it highlighted a growing divide between the old way of doing things, where mistakes were punished, and the new culture of support and collaboration. Despite their best efforts to resist, Evelyn and Nathaniel could no longer deny the shifts happening around them. Evelyn continued to cling to her pride, maintaining a veneer of professionalism while quietly undermining Naomi and Jeremiah whenever she could. Nathaniel, on the other hand, grew more vocal in his dissatisfaction, his sarcasm and complaints becoming a daily occurrence. But their resistance began to backfire. During a staff meeting, Jeremiah outlined plans for a new mentorship program, pairing experienced employees with newer hires to foster collaboration and learning. Nathaniel immediately scoffed, leaning back in his chair with an exaggerated sigh. "Mentorship?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "What's next? Holding hands and singing songs?" A few of the older staff chuckled nervously, but the room quickly fell silent when Elijah stepped forward. "Nathaniel," Elijah said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "If you have a constructive suggestion, we'd love to hear it. But if all you have is cynicism, I suggest you keep it to yourself." The quiet that followed was deafening. Nathaniel's face flushed, but he didn't respond. For the first time, he seemed to realize that his antics were no longer going unchecked. One evening, the restaurant hosted a large family gathering for a diverse group of patrons. The staff, now accustomed to working under Jeremiah and Naomi's leadership, handled the event seamlessly. Evelyn, assigned to assist Naomi on the floor, found herself in unfamiliar territory. She approached a table with a hesitant smile, taking orders from a family of 4. The youngest child, a curious boy with bright eyes, looked up at her and asked, "Are you the boss?" Evelyn hesitated, glancing toward Naomi, who was busy assisting another table. "Not anymore," she said quietly, the admission feeling heavier than she expected. The boy grinned. "My dad says the new boss is nice. He gave us a table right away when we came in last time." Evelyn nodded, her smile faltering as she walked away. The boy's innocent comment lingered in her mind, forcing her to confront a truth she had been avoiding. The changes Elijah had implemented weren't just for show. They were real, and they were working. Over time, the resistance from the older staff began to erode. The new hires, inspired by Naomi's leadership and Jeremiah's consistency, set a standard of professionalism and respect that became impossible to ignore. Even those who had initially doubted the changes started to adapt, albeit reluctantly. One afternoon, Evelyn found herself working alongside Mia during a particularly busy shift. As they coordinated to clear tables and serve guests, Evelyn caught herself giving Mia a word of encouragement, a habit she had picked up from Naomi without realizing it. "Good job handling that table," she said softly. Mia blinked in surprise, then smiled. "Thanks, Evelyn." The exchange was brief, almost insignificant, but it marked a turning point for Evelyn. For the first time, she saw the value in the new system, not as a threat to her authority, but as an opportunity to grow. By the end of the month, the transformation of Willow Grove was undeniable. The restaurant, once a bastion of exclusivity and unspoken prejudice, had become a symbol of progress and inclusivity. Customers noticed the difference, leaving glowing reviews about the warm, welcoming atmosphere and attentive service. Even Nathaniel, though still resistant, began to tone down his antics. He worked his shifts quietly, his sarcasm replaced by a grudging acceptance that the old ways were gone for good. And Evelyn? She was still adjusting, her pride making it difficult to fully embrace the changes. But deep down, she knew there was no going back. The world she had built was gone, replaced by something better. And, though she wouldn't admit it, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps she could find her place in it after all. Willow Grove buzzed with the soft hum of dinner service, but Evelyn Whitaker felt like the only sound she could hear was the beating of her own heart. Standing near the service station, she clutched her notepad tightly, glancing nervously toward table 12. The Carter family, a black couple and their young daughter, sat waiting, their warm demeanor a stark contrast to the cold knot twisting in Evelyn's stomach. From across the room, Elijah and Jeremiah watched her intently, their expressions unreadable. The weight of their silent scrutiny pressed down on her like a lead blanket. For Evelyn, this wasn't just another table, it was a test. Taking a deep breath, she approached with her most practiced smile, balancing professionalism and unease. "Good evening," she began, her voice carefully controlled. "Welcome to Willow Grove. May I start you off with some drinks?" Desmond Carter, a man with a quiet confidence, looked up at her and nodded. "Water for all of us, thank you," he said, his voice steady but polite. As Evelyn jotted down the order, she caught the gaze of their young daughter, Tiana, who was swinging her legs beneath the table. The little girl studied Evelyn with a curious intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. "Why don't you smile like the other lady?" Tiana asked suddenly, her innocent voice piercing the moment. Evelyn froze, her practiced facade faltering. I'm smiling," she replied weakly, unsure of what else to say. Tiana tilted her head, unconvinced. "Not like Miss Naomi," she said matter-of-factly. Evelyn's cheeks flushed, and she quickly excused herself, retreating to the service station to regain her composure. Behind her, she could feel Elijah's and Jeremiah's eyes following her every move, their silence more powerful than any words they could have said. Returning with the drinks, Evelyn placed the glasses on the table carefully, avoiding Tiana's gaze. "Here you are," she said softly, her voice tinged with nervousness. As she was about to leave, Tiana spoke again, her words sharp in their simplicity. "Do you like us?" Evelyn blinked, startled. "Of course," she said quickly, her voice defensive. The little girl frowned. "Then why don't you look at us like Miss Naomi does?" Desmond and Felicia exchanged a glance, their expressions calm but knowing. "Tiana," Felicia said gently, "let's not bother the nice lady." "But she doesn't seem happy to see us," Tiana pressed, her tone as curious as it was blunt. Evelyn's face burned as the words sank in. She opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss. Instead, Desmond leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but firm. "You don't have to explain yourself to us," he said, meeting her gaze. "But just remember, people notice how they're treated." The words hit harder than Evelyn expected. She nodded stiffly and walked away, her hands trembling as she returned to the service station. For the rest of the evening, their polite smiles and measured words replayed in her mind, each one a reminder of the silent judgments she had made in the past. As the evening wound down, Evelyn found herself standing near the entrance, watching as the Carters prepared to leave. Desmond caught her eye and offered a small, kind smile as he adjusted his coat. "Thank you for your service tonight," he said warmly. "It's not easy to learn, but it's always worth it." Evelyn swallowed hard, his words settling heavily on her shoulders. She nodded, unable to muster a response beyond a quiet, "Have a good evening." After the Carters exited, Evelyn turned to find Elijah standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to drive home the lesson she had been avoiding for so long. Sinking into one of the chairs, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of honesty. She had always believed she was professional, fair, even kind. But tonight had shown her the truth. Her actions, no matter how subtle, carried weight. Every glance, every word, every hesitation, it all mattered. For the first time, Evelyn saw herself through the eyes of others, and the reflection wasn't flattering. But alongside the shame came a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could change. The dining area of Willow Grove was quiet, transformed into an impromptu meeting space. All the staff were gathered, their faces reflecting a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Jeremiah and Naomi stood near Elijah, their calm confidence contrasting with the unease that hung in the room. Evelyn sat at the back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unreadable. Elijah stood at the front, his gaze steady as he addressed the room. "I want to thank all of you for your hard work over these past weeks," he began, his voice firm but not unkind. "Change is never easy, and I know this hasn't been an easy transition for many of you, but it was necessary." He paused, letting his words settle. "Today marks the next step in our journey. Willow Grove is no longer just a restaurant. It's a symbol, a place where everyone, regardless of who they are, is treated with respect and dignity. That goes for our customers and for all of you." Murmurs rippled through the room, and Elijah raised a hand to silence them. "I also understand that not everyone here agrees with the changes we've made, and that's okay. This isn't a place for everyone, but it is a place for those who believe in the vision we're building." Elijah stepped closer to the group, his voice steady but resolute. "So today, I'm giving you a choice. If you're ready to embrace this new chapter, to grow with us, and to uphold the values we stand for, we welcome you to stay. But if you feel this isn't the right fit for you, I respect that decision as well. You'll leave with my gratitude and a fair severance package. The choice is yours." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Evelyn's gaze dropped to the table in front of her, her mind racing. Nathaniel, seated a few rows away, shifted uncomfortably, his usual smirk replaced by uncertainty. Elijah finished with a quiet but powerful statement. "Willow Grove is about moving forward. I hope you'll choose to be part of that future." After the meeting, most of the staff lingered in small groups, discussing their options. Evelyn, however, remained seated, her eyes fixed on the empty notepad in front of her. She didn't notice Elijah approach until he spoke. "Evelyn," he said, his tone calm but direct. "Do you have a moment?" She looked up, startled, but nodded. "Of course," she said quietly. Elijah gestured toward a quieter corner of the room, and they walked over together. For a moment, he studied her, his expression unreadable. "You've been here a long time," he began. "You've seen this place through good times and bad. I respect that." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. "But I also think you've struggled with what we're trying to do here," Elijah continued, "and I want to understand why." Evelyn hesitated, her pride warring with the vulnerability she felt creeping in. "It's not that I don't see the value in what you're doing," she said finally. "It's just, I built my career on a system that rewarded control, discipline, and results. And now, it feels like everything I've worked for doesn't matter anymore." Elijah nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand that. Change can feel like losing everything you thought you knew. But sometimes, what feels like loss is really just growth in disguise." Evelyn looked at him, her defenses beginning to crumble. "I don't know if I can change," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You already have," Elijah said simply. "The fact that you're willing to have this conversation tells me that. Change isn't about perfection. It's about progress. And progress starts with recognizing where we've fallen short." Evelyn blinked back the tears threatening to form. "I don't want to fail," she said softly. "You won't," Elijah replied, his voice steady and reassuring. "But the first step is deciding whether you're willing to try." The next morning, Evelyn arrived at Willow Grove earlier than usual. The restaurant was quiet, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows casting golden light across the empty tables. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of control pressing down on her. Instead, there was something lighter's hope. She walked into the kitchen, where Naomi was organizing the morning prep, with a few of the newer staff members. Naomi looked up, surprised to see Evelyn so early. "Good morning," Evelyn said, her voice warmer than usual. "Do you need a hand?" Naomi hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure, we're setting up the new inventory system. Could use an extra pair of eyes." As Evelyn joined the group, she noticed how the team worked together seamlessly, their collaboration creating an energy she hadn't seen before. It wasn't about control or hierarchy. It was about mutual respect. From his office, Elijah watched the scene unfold, a faint smile playing on his lips. Willow Grove was changing, one moment at a time, and while there was still work to be done, the seeds of progress had taken root. By the end of the day, Evelyn found herself standing at the front door as the last customers left. As she turned to lock up, she caught her reflection in the glass, a woman no longer weighed down by fear of change, but lifted by the possibility of it. For the first time in a long time, she felt ready to embrace the future. This story isn't just about transforming a restaurant. It's about the power of courage, understanding, and the willingness to confront one's own biases. This journey shows us that sometimes the greatest changes don't come from external forces, but from the strength to look inward, admit our mistakes, and choose a better path. Reflecting on this story, it's worth asking, have you ever found yourself in a situation like Evelyn's, faced with your own assumptions or mistakes and forced to make a choice? Or perhaps you've witnessed someone break free from the chains of prejudice and take a step toward growth and understanding. These moments can be transformative, and they remind us that change, though uncomfortable, is always possible. What do you think? Do you believe everyone deserves a second chance, even after making significant mistakes? Have you ever been in a position where you had to prove yourself to others after being judged unfairly? We'd love to hear your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you and you enjoy heartfelt, thought-provoking tales like this, Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Every story we share is meant to touch your heart, inspire positive change, and remind us all of the importance of kindness, empathy, and equality. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope this story left you with not only a range of emotions, but also a renewed perspective on how we treat one another. We can't wait to see you in the next story.